the quarter by quarter tweaking of things is not going to make you a sustainable business. You have to determine, given everything going on in the world, what is the future of soft drinks? Is there a future in soft drinks? Those are the hard questions. You just can't sit there with blinders on saying people will always drink Coke, because that's not true. People drank sarsaparilla in the 1800s. They don't drink that shit no more. Like nothing is forever.
Welcome to the Conversation Factory. I'm your host, Daniel Stillman. I'm investigating how we create change through changing conversations. Each episode, I'll talk to an amazing conversation designer to try to distill insights we can all bring into our work and lives. You can be part of the conversation in two ways. The first, head over to theconversationfactory.com and subscribe to the newsletter to never miss an episode. That's theconversationfactory.com. The other way is to be part of the show. If there's a challenging transformation you want some help with, head over to theconversationfactory.com/coaching to fill out a survey to get 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on the show. Be a part of the show and get 30 minutes of coaching at theconversationfactory.com/coaching. My guest today is Philip McKenzie, the co-host of Two Dope Boys and a Podcast, a bi-weekly podcast on trends and cultural insight. Philip is best described as a polymath. He's a former domestic equity trader for Goldman Sachs, and he's a writer, a rabid music fan, and an accomplished DJ. Today we talk about consistency and authenticity in conversations between brands and the fans they seek to connect with, how companies need to focus on long-term thinking, not short-term gains, and on growth as a false model for our times. I'm just going to welcome you, Philip. It's been a while. I'm really glad to have you here, and I've got a bunch of questions for you. And one of the things I pulled off of the website for your podcast, Two Dope Boys and a Podcast, was this great quote, which I really loved. It said, "In creative industries where culture should be the focus, short-term thinking demands instant results, not allowing for the natural gestation of cultural movements." And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that gestation period and short-term versus long-term thinking. I think it's a really critical part of having great conversations.
Definitely. First of all, thanks for having me on. It has been way too long, but we're going to make up for it right now with some great insights and some great conversation. And I think short-term, long-term is a great way to launch into this. You know, my career, we talk about this a lot on Two Dope Boys and a Podcast, a show that I co-host with Michael Brooks, in that my background is a Wall Street finance background. And the Wall Street model, more than ever, has become a quarter by quarter short-term model. Their thinking is merely designed to maximize profit over the shortest amount of time possible, because it's largely an industry, despite their branding, run on speculation.
Yeah.
And that speculation does not care about the long-term value of a concern or an investment, because they're not making investments. They're merely speculating on price movement, most of that price movement being short-term. And the measurement of short-term can be second to second in some cases, or it can be a quarter or two, or that varies, but the mentality is that of short-term. And what I found over the years from moving from a Wall Street career to a career in marketing, branding, and what I would call culture spaces, is that same attitude, that same mentality has infiltrated into culture spaces where those who seek to understand or benefit from culture no longer can take the time to understand, to allow cultural movements, whatever they might be, to simply be. You know, they have to come in a predatory type of relationship to just extract whatever value that they can. And our ideology is basically that doesn't serve anyone in a productive and constructive manner, and that if you're actually going to exist in spaces, really any space, but especially in spaces of culture, you have to take a long-term perspective on that. You can't expect to just jump on the latest trend for a quarter or two, and then expect that to change the nature and face of your brand or your business.
Yeah, I mean, you're almost talking about authenticity, right? That if you're not participating in the culture authentically, the people who are part of that culture are they'll sense that, right? And then you're not going to be having a real interaction with them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, authenticity is a word, it's one of these words that, we talk about this on the show. It's used so often that it's lost. It's begun to lose meaning.
Is there a better word that we should be using besides?
I don't know. There probably is. I should probably work on that. Maybe we can do some of that kind of linguistic anthropology together to come up with a better word. I think people, at least, we understand and share the knowledge of what that word means, and everyone says that they're seeking to be authentic, but authenticity requires taking risk, which most institutions and organizations are very uncomfortable with. It requires failing at times. You take one step back for every 2 steps forward. That's another thing that institutions and organizations are very uncomfortable with. So, again, I think they use these words and we all understand them as powerful signifiers, but I'm skeptical as if they're really, truly willing to commit to what that means.
So, so I'm wondering this short-term versus long-term thinking, and use this term, the natural gestation of cultural movements. This is being in it to win it, like really caring and having an authentic relating relationship. Is there an example of like a brand that you've seen in the culture that you've worked with where they've done it right? Like how we should yes, we should do it that way.
Yeah, I think like we reference Patagonia a lot. I think they're a company that is completely values driven, and they speak directly to the culture of outdoors people, environmentalists. Like, they speak that language. The founder comes from that space. As a native New Yorker, I'm from Brooklyn. That's really not my world. I'm a concrete, glass, and metal guy because that's just how I grew up. Yes. But even as someone now looking at a company like that, I feel their mission, despite the fact that I don't do those things. Like, I don't mountain climb, I don't raft, I'm not an outdoors guy like that. But their commitment to being true to the environment, to being true to people truly discovering those spaces, to not have a rampant consumer model, to be concerned about workers' rights. So even though I'm not their target audience, the company really speaks to me because their values align with my own regardless of the activity. So I think they're a company that, in a way, their culture and their values have transcended the activity of what they provide a service for, and speaks to people like myself who care about sort of a bigger picture, regardless of climbing a mountain and camping and all that kind of stuff, which are very great pursuits. They're not my pursuits. So I think Patagonia is a company that I always cite and reference and think about when it comes to being authentic and living in that culture space. And they've done it over a long amount of time. Like, some of these things are popular now, but when they've been doing this, they weren't popular. They merely were how they viewed the world. And I think that's another piece of it. Like, it's easy to see people kind of jump into markets, jump into things just, again, for that profit extraction. But it's different when you've sort of been there from the beginning and taken the ride, because that's kind of really all you knew. Like, from everything I've read about the founder, there was no other thing for him. Like, this was kind of it.
Yeah,
you know,
it's that's so interesting, because there's one thing I want to poke at there, which is this idea of being there from the beginning and not, you know, the OG thing where it's like, well, if you weren't there at the start, then you wouldn't understand it, and that's a really high bar for authenticity, right? That
it is, but. Yeah, and I get that. There's a lot of that. Like, we have those conversations all the time around, particularly around hip hop and music. I think it's clearly one of the more relevant cultural forces of my lifetime, if not the most relevant cultural force of my lifetime. And
of all of ours, by the way. Like, I don't know if you've watched the new Netflix series on hip hop. Like,
I've not, though I've heard good things about it.
It's wonderful. I mean, and it shows that it's infiltrated so much of our lives. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, and no, in such a seamless way. And so, you know, I grew up at a time when hip hop was not pop music. Like, it's pop music now in the sense of not as a judgment, just as it's popular music. You go everywhere and hip hop is there, you know. And when I was growing up, hip hop was something that people thought wouldn't even last another year. It was a fad. It was something that was irrelevant, and the music was not even real music. Like, every popular way in which we consume music rejected hip hop. But I remember one of the first concerts that I went to, which was the Fresh Fest tour with Run DMC, Houdini, Fat Boys. I'm probably missing some people, but Run DMC were the big headliners. You know, Sprite sponsored that. So someone at Sprite, and Sprite has had kind of a long history and tradition with hip hop, but it started with things like Fresh Fest. So I kind of give Sprite the benefit of the doubt, because I'm like, okay, you kind of got this in 1983, 1984. You know, some new fizzy drink or whatever it might be that kind of comes in and wants to just do something with Chance the Rapper just because he's one of the more popular rappers. I'm not gonna give that as much credit. You know, you gotta put some skin in the game. That's just the way it is. Like, sorry, everybody's got to do that. You know.
Yeah. So this is interesting, because, like, if you can't, not everybody can claim to be there at the start, right?
Oh yeah.
And so that's
not. No, we can't time jump.
Right. You can't. Which? I'm sorry.
Oh, I said we can't time jump.
Yeah, we can't time jump.
Go back.
Yeah. So it's like, if you weren't there in the 80s, you don't really know what it was like. Well, you're like, well, okay, you know, fine. So it seems like the other way to get this authentic relating is to keep showing up.
Yeah,
and to show commitment.
Yeah, you have to be there. You know, you have to, you can't necessarily no one can go back to the 80s or the 90s. And, you know, even as a fan of music, I'm engrossed in tons of conversations around, old school and the golden era. And, you know, you just have these kind of conversations around things like that. And every form has that, you know. But, you know, if you're a brand or organization and you show like you're willing, again, to nurture, to grow with things. I think Converse is a good example of that, to kind of bring a more modern player. They weren't necessarily engaged in hip hop at the nascent stages. But because they have a commitment to music, they've created like studio spaces. Like, they support artists generally. And then many of those artists are hip hop. You know, they create collaborations and mixtape type things. So even though, 'cause they have like the Rubber Track Studios, that started in Brooklyn, but I think they have a couple more locations in other cities. So I look at Converse and I'm like, okay, you get this. Like, you built a place for artists to come together. You have a studio where artists can come in and work for free. That's a part of the culture and underlying ethics of all art, but particularly hip hop. So if Converse puts something out with rubber traps and they have rubber tracks and they have rappers, I'm like, okay, this makes sense to me because it's consistent and you're playing the long game. You know, you're not just throwing some mess together, pulling out who's hot at the moment. So I think that's the difference, you know, of a brand who came in later but has shown an actual real connection with its audience through music.
Yeah, this consistency thing. I'm thinking of Scion as another company that has just shown we love music and they're all about music, and they create that regular. They bring in unknown artists and they give them support, and they do that they do that year after year, and that consistency, that's where you start to see that authenticity.
And that's one of the challenges, like a brand like that I think they've shifted, or I don't know if they're in this new year, like if they're even around in the way in which they thought they were going to be around. Like, I'm not 100% sure, but I think they're kind of dropped the title and they've made some changes there. And I think that's one of those risks of when you have a brand that is so affiliated with, like, they do music festivals, they were doing like a lot of stuff and put a lot of money on that. If that brand identity shifts or changes, the risk to the people they were kind of promoting is really high. You know, so I think that's another one of those sorts of challenges, and we all have that challenge with patronage because it's ultimately what we're talking about. I mean, the Medicis were patrons of their time, and artists are always looking for those types of relationships. It's just now it's been codified toward looking at for those relationships through brands and other opportunities because they're the ones who have the money. And as much as people don't want to talk about it, art needs money. You know, the starving artist paradigm is bullshit.
Ha! Well, it's boring to be starving.
Yeah. And it always has been. You know, that's never been a reality of the arts. As much as people try to celebrate that, like, artists should be compensated for their work.
Absolutely. And there's a conflict there because, you know, one of the things still in this at the tail end of this quote about short-term versus long-term thinking on the Two Dope Boys website, you talk about how every little thing doesn't need to be wrung out of an authentic conversation. And art has this idea of like, oh, well, we're just here for the love. And brands are like, oh, well, we're also just here for the love, but the money's there. And so that has to be discussed in an authentic way.
Yeah, it has to be. Like, the money has to be discussed in a grown up, mature, holistic demystification way, you know? And until we can do that, just generally, much less in culture spaces, it becomes the default justification for everything that somebody does. You know, like, oh, of course I took the money because it's money. You know, you're going to turn down X amount of dollars to do whatever. And that we can't just have that be the default. You know, we have to now have a bigger conversation as to the whys and how all of this even exists. That might be off topic, but I think, you know, if you're going to talk about the arts and who supports the arts and what gets funding and what gets validity and all of that sort of impacts culture spaces, then we have to talk about the money part of it as well.
No, and so there's something really interesting here, which I think is worth pushing on, which is because you use this word as well, this idea of extracting. And in a way, the ethos that's going on today, more and more people are talking about sustainability and respect for resources. I was just at an interaction design conference, and people were talking about respectful design. And when you talk about native peoples and respecting the fact that they've been here forever and they want the resources in the land to be there forever, you have a different attitude towards community. I was in a talk with somebody around community design, and they said, oh, so we want to really cultivate the relationships of these mentors, and then we want to extract some, IP from them so that we can build this other thing. And I'm like, extract? Is extract the word you want to use? Maybe do you want to use cultivate or something else besides extract? And I think this extractive relationship, if brands to artists and artists to brands as well, it shouldn't be extractive. It should be symbiotic, right?
Yeah, it definitely should be. And I think the language is really important. We did on our podcast, we did a predictive episode, a 2017 outlook.
Yeah, I listened to that. Episode. That was a great one.
Oh, thank you. And one of the things I talked about was language, this use of language, and language is going to be more and more important to understand just the definition of things, the history of things, and so on and so forth. And even a term like extraction, I think it's useful if the person you were talking to said that, if they meant it. And my pushback would be to understand the mentality behind why the word was chosen and what you mean by it, rather than just finding another word. Because I think that branding is a big part of it. Talking about we'll just figure out a way to write really good copy, but then our behavior doesn't really change. And Silicon Valley, the tech space has been I've been a long time critic of those spaces because I never bought into their branding. I looked at all of those things, whether it's Davos and all of that world, and I was like, this is obvious bullshit, because you can't, those are incompatible things. You can't fly to Davos to have a conversation about and talk about how climate change is the biggest threat to mankind, and you're all on private jets. Those are incompatible things. So it's I gotta see your behavior more so than your words. Your behavior will tell me everything about you. And so organizations that talk about sustainability, whether it's sustainability or culture or diversity, whatever it is, if they don't do it when these things are actually, they're challenges, but they're only challenges because no one wants to sacrifice, so they want to keep all of this the way it is and expect a different result, and that's impossible.
Well, that's Einstein's definition of insanity.
Yeah,
to
it's
expect the same result by doing the exact same thing over and over again.
No one wants to take the pay cut. No one wants to sacrifice anything. No one wants to have the difficult conversation, but yet we convene constantly wondering why nothing has changed. And to me, it's fairly obvious, but that's a like I said, another vector.
Yeah, I mean, this is a high bar for any brand or any movement to reach. This kind of authenticity comes at a big cost in a way, where it's everything you do has to be held to this mark of, is it authentic?
Well, I think it has. No one is perfect. I think if we, in a confusing and muddled world, if you're asking for perfection to be the bar, then we're all gonna fall far short of that, but I think it all depends on what you want, what's important to you, I use Airbnb as an example all the time, and I'm a supporter generally. I use it when I travel almost exclusively. So I get what they're about, but it's do you want to be a true community that brings people together and lives a certain set of ethics and values? Or do you just want to be a renegade Marriott? Those are two distinct things, and those are choices that you're making. So all of your legal issues and sort of cultural issues, those were choices to go down a particular road that would bring you under fire of, local and state municipalities, because your desire to satisfy investors in a capitalist VC model, IPO model. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, those are just choices. Do you want to be a really community-based organization that's maybe worth $1 billion, maybe $1.5 billion, and maybe you never IPO? Maybe you just chug along and do what you're doing in your private company. Or do you want to be renegade Marriott and IPO and cash out? And, I'm not judging those people, but to pretend that those are not distinct choices that are made, that's sort of not the case.
You're absolutely, and this goes back to what you said right at the beginning around what Hillary Clinton, our president, or should have been, which we can talk about another time. But she talked about quarterly capitalism, and I don't even know if that can be changed, honestly, because people do have to anticipate their financial output, and they need to pay everybody's bills, and they're expected to grow, right? That's a real challenge.
Yeah, but that's also an idea, growth in a way is a philosophy. It's an idea that we've all accepted as just a basic truth. And I think if you look, again, I'm not the outdoorsman, but that's why I respond to a company like Patagonia. The earth itself is not a unexhaustible resource of anything.
No.
We think it is. And so we've put that model into everything that we do, which is why we consume, we extract. Oh, there's always going to be more, insert whatever it is. And just as much as like the earth is not an inexhaustible resource, a company's unceasingly unending growth cycle is also not realistic. If you're Coke, how many new markets are there? Are there places on earth that you and I could go to where there is no Coke? Like, at this point, people are now making a choice as to whether or not they want to drink Coke versus any other number of options. But if you're Coke, you have to understand that the available space for new market entry is almost zero. So you're who you are based on scales that have existed for X number of years. That's now going to change. The quarter by quarter tweaking of things is not going to make you a sustainable business. You have to determine, given everything going on in the world, what is the future of soft drinks? Is there a future in soft drinks? Those are the hard questions. You just can't sit there with blinders on saying people will always drink Coke, because that's not true. People drank sarsaparilla in the 1800s. They don't drink that shit no more. Like, nothing is forever, And so that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, we talk about this a lot, like this pushback against scale. Everything has to be big, because then tells us the only things that are worth doing are things that can be big.
So look, I that what you're saying resonates with me, and I get that, but I'm small and I like being small. But when you consult with brands, do they want to hear this kind of perspective?
Yeah. The ones that are smart do. The ones that aren't will continue to go down a road that only leads one place. And you see it everywhere in the huge amount of just angst and disconnect. That's everywhere. It's everywhere. It permeates everything. So yeah, these are uncomfortable conversations. They don't necessarily make people feel good because it challenges them and pushes back on sort of their preconceived notions of how this all works. But I think it's very important to have that conversation, to push people to think about what else is possible. Because if we don't start to redesign or reimagine all of this, it ultimately won't matter anyway, because we won't be here.
Hey, this is Daniel. We're about at the halfway point, so this is a great time. You might want to get up, stretch your legs, and get some popcorn, fill up your soda. Also, head over to theconversationfactory.com and sign up for the newsletter. Stay in touch. I'm always trying to extract some best practices from these interviews and make some great tools, turn them into PDFs to share with you. And those are things I send to my subscribers, so make sure you head on over to theconversationfactory.com, sign up for the newsletter, and stay in touch. Now, do you find that people are open to that, or do you have to sort of crack open their perspective and get them to think a little bit differently? How do you design that conversation so that they think a little bit bigger or differently, or just sort of rotate the way they're looking at things?
Well, I think it's a function of asking a lot of questions, like kind of getting to the core of the person, not to sound too much like a therapist, but in my experiences, most of the people that I've worked with in organizations, and I won't be super specific, but it's been almost universal. They know these things even if they can't put voice to them. It's sort of like Morpheus talking to Neo at the beginning of The Matrix. Like, it's something that you feel in the back of your mind, but you can't quite put your finger on it. They know oftentimes that things they're doing don't matter. Like, they want to actually do bigger, better, more imaginative work. Like, they know the limitations of the spaces that they're in, and that's why they bring us on to, in a weird way. I feel like they're trying to manifest their own possibility by using like an outside agent, like if me and Michael do consulting work, like they as the insider, they maybe can't even express it, but if they bring us into the organization, we sort of manifest it through the fact that we're like, look, we don't really have skin in the game here. We're going to tell you the truth.
This is such an interesting point, Phil, like the inside versus the outside voice, and you almost disrupting the power structure of an organization, and in the sense that like they are empowering you, but they give you money and they give you their time in a way to get their own time back and to get some focus on things.
Yeah, people want to do good work. People want to feel like their lives have meaning. And as much as that has been, again, devalued by this tech Silicon Valley bullshit, it remains true. And that's one of the reasons why we push back so much against, like, we call it like post-demographic realities. This group of people is like this, and this, millennials are all like this. And, when we've done research around, like, with millennials and older workers like Gen X, as the next kind of level of management, we found that they might express it differently, but they want the same things in terms of, like, for their life. They want to feel, appreciated. They want to do meaningful work. They want to be challenged, and so millennials might express that differently, but at the end of the day, the people in the organization are all striving for the same stuff. If they don't get it, that's where you have sort of the disconnect, where people start feeling like, oh, nothing matters and who cares, and I'm just going to dial it in, or it's just a structure, or, well, that's not how we do things here. And, those are just the catchphrases of when people feel like they're in a rut.
Yeah, and you guys come in and help break up that pattern.
Yeah. By asking the uncomfortable questions, by pushing people. And of course, a lot of this is slow work, like, but we live, myself and Michael, we live that, what we talk about. Like, we're in this for the long term. We know that these things are important, even if organizations and institutions, they might not get it. Like, you're going to get it eventually.
Right. Well, so, and this gets us full loop to where we started about maintaining an authentic conversation means keeping that. I mean, there's this word cadence, this rhythm of connectivity, right? You can't, you sort of just, you keep pushing on it and something will shift eventually.
Mm-hmm. And but you also have to be open for new information. Like, I think we try not to be dogmatic. You have to go out there and talk to people, like, ask questions, like, observe things. Like, try to, like, we call it like invisible dots. Like, you want to connect things which people might not see, so we spend a lot of time reading and studying and thinking about, okay, if this is going on in this industry, totally had nothing to do with like a client or anything we're working on, then I'm like, all right, how does this parallel to something else? Like, what are the big trends? What are the words that I'm seeing? It doesn't matter what it's about. I could be reading an article about, priest in some small town versus reading something about the latest release from Adidas. Like, two things that you would think are completely disconnected and likely are. I'm just making these up examples, but I'm still going to look at those articles and think about what are the things that are similar. Are there some messages? Are there something in there where I could like create a larger trend?
Yeah, you're collecting. Danny Meyer talks about this. I don't know if you've ever read his book, Setting the Table. It's about experience design. He's, the restaurateur behind Shake Shack, and he talks about collecting dots and then connecting dots. And it's a great, and I love that you are using the same. It's just a very natural way of thinking about it. You actually said this. I was looking at your website this morning where you talked about analog movements being driven by experiences, and that you have to touch and feel the retail stores, the barbershop, the skate parks, the pop-up stores, and really observe and extrapolate what's central in the culture. That's almost a direct quote from you. And I think that's really, like, you're talking about going and touching and feeling what's going on in the world.
Yeah, you have to be around people and experiences for all of this to make sense. And if you're not, then you're only sort of regurgitating maybe your stereotypes or what you've heard about something, but you've never really experienced it. If you don't know the reaction, like I DJ, and if you're not in the space to see the reaction of a song, even if nobody's heard it before, it's something that's infectious. And that's like my example of, like, you gotta be in the space. So people will tell me all the time, like, oh, I've never heard of this artist. I've never heard of this person. And I'm like, yo, it's a hit. I don't care what you've heard of. I don't care what you think. This is a hit because I've seen it. I've seen the reaction when I play the song. Yeah. The minute it comes on, even if it's not going to be that jump off where everybody's like, oh, shit. People will come up to me like, yo, what was that? Like, yo, what was that cut? Like, oh, you played this like 3 songs ago. What was that? Like,
yeah, it gets under their skin.
It's amazing how it happens. And I think all of our experiences need to be that way. We need to invite more curiosity into our lives. And a lot of that is analog. Like, we spend a lot of time online. Obviously, digital is everywhere. But sometimes you got to break out of that and actually go out and be around people, in spaces, and see what it's really like to be whatever. Like, if you're a retail person and you don't go to stores, if you don't go to boutiques, if you're not actually in these places, then how are you going to tell someone what it's really like?
No, you have to have that real connection. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, and we don't have too much more time left. We talked about, this balance between the digital and the real, like making sure that you're in touch with the real. And, in music, and you're a music lover, you know that rhythm is as much silence as it is sound.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a little bit about mindfulness last time, and I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time to talk about stepping away from all the noise. Because you're talking about trying to drink from the fire hose and pull it all in and get out there in the world and touch everything. But I know that you invest a lot of time in pulling back from everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like mindfulness is an act that is a radical act. It's again been, and me and Michael talk about this all the time. He shared a friend of his wrote a really good blog entry just like few years ago, because he shared it with me a while ago, and I constantly refer to it. I don't have it in front of me, or I'll tell it to you, but I'll share it with you at another point.
Please,
and you can put it in your show notes and maybe update this. But it's mindfulness has been sort of like now co-opted to become just something that helps you deal with the incessant amount of bullshit that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So it's just like, okay, how do we make you a better drone? We'll just give you like some feel-good techniques, that won't require too much of a sacrifice, won't require you to really be introspective. It won't require you to do any heavy lifting toward actually becoming a better, more self-actualized person. It's just going to make you a better drone within this, soul-crushing late-stage capitalism that we live in. So I reject that wholeheartedly.
That is quite a condemnation. I love that.
Yeah, because I see it, like I have a yoga practice, I meditate, and I watch how people are like sometimes in the studio. Like they behave in a way of like, again, the same selfishness that permeates all of this. Like they take up too much space, they come in and spread out all over the place, and I'm like, yo, it's a studio. Like you only need your mat.
Yeah.
I've watched people all around the world do yoga without Lululemon clothes on and fancy, so-called sustainable rubberized mats and shit. They do that shit with whatever the fuck they got on, sitting anywhere.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, that's like if you were really coming into the studio with the spirit of being connected to other people, that would pull you away from selfishness. This idea of like, again, taking more than you need. It's a simple example, but I notice it all the time, and I'm just like, yo, you're full of shit. Like yoga to you is just an exercise. It's just, you might as well be on a treadmill. And that's fine. Everybody finds their own way. But when we talk about mindfulness, it's about being a radical practice. It's not about just becoming a better, more efficient drone, because when you read a lot about this stuff in sort of mainstream, that's what they talk about. Like, you're really stressed out. Like, this will help you de-stress and be more efficient and use your time. And are you having troubles reading more books? This will help you. Like,
you're almost talking about having an extractive relationship with your mindfulness practice, which
that's what it is.
Which is, again, is like, how could that work? Right.
Yeah. Instead of like asking yourself, well, why are you stressed? Like, why do you feel the need to be more efficient? What does that mean? And again, it comes back to language. Like, we've adapted the language of tools to describe a human experience, and we're human beings,
which is not efficient. I would say, like, I always make the example that a tree does not make the exact right number of leaves. There's no like, there it is, we've got enough leaves. They make way more leaves than they need. There's nothing efficient about nature. And I think we try to make ourselves efficient and we try to make our companies efficient. And there's some damage that you do to yourself that way.
Yeah. We got to allow for a human experience, which isn't going to always be efficient.
No, it's not.
Keep that trend going. So when we talk about mindfulness, it's in that vein. I'm not recommending apps to anyone or any of that nonsense. It's like really use whatever practice you have to question all of this and then ask yourself whether or not it's worth it.
Well, and I also know that you really try to control your technology. You just bring the iPod to the gym. You don't have your phone with you all the time. Like, you don't want that.
The phone is never with me in the gym. I don't have email on my phone at all.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I tell if I'm meeting someone for the first time, I send them my phone number and I'm like, look, you got to text me or you got to call me if there's going to be a change. I'm fine if there's a change, but emailing me will not give me the message because I do not have email on my phone. And that's on purpose. Like,
well, you talked about a year ago this idea of controlling urgency and deciding what's urgent and what's not in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, and most of this stuff that comes in isn't urgent. Like, it's not to say that it's not important, but it's not urgent. And I think people project urgency onto you. Some of that is to exercise control. Like, they feel if they can solicit a response from someone right away, it's put them now in a position of control. It's justifying what they do, when most of us don't do anything important. It's a lot of stuff like that I just don't buy into. I'm like, you don't need me right now.
Yeah. So it's funny to me, this process, this podcast for me is about exploring people like yourself who are doing great work around designing the conversations in their life and their work. And it seems like one of the conversations that you think should just not be designed at all is, in a way, that mindfulness interior conversation. You try to undesign it as much as possible. You want it to be, that's where you go away from all the trying to make something be a thing.
Yeah. And everyone can find their own way. Like, they don't have to do any of these so-called mindful things. If they do, great. If they don't, that's fine as well. But you got to find a way to have some semblance of like peace and serenity and not be frenetic, in your pursuits. Because again, our brains are just not wired for that type of constant triggering, particularly when what you're being triggered, what's doing the triggering isn't really that important. It just isn't.
Well, so, and this goes back again, like, every little thing does not have to be wrung out of a relationship.
Yeah.
And that's true for brands, and it's true for art, and it's true for your mindfulness thing too. You're just letting it be what it is and not trying to like squeeze every little bit out of it. You come back to it again and again and again.
Yeah. Yeah, you gotta be, and that's an analog ideology. Like, it might not be as fast, it might not be super connected. Like, I don't need to check in from the studio, I don't need the picture, about to tackle yoga, wish me luck, that I share with like a million people just so they can know, like, oh wow, that Phil McKenzie, he's really about that practice, like that makes him such an interesting person. Like, you don't need to do all of that.
You just need to be doing it. You're just living it.
Just need to do whatever it is that you do, But
how do you get credit for it? If people not seeing it on Instagram.
Exactly. Or you just don't have Instagram, like me.
So, listen, I wanna let you get out of here. I really appreciate the time. Is there anything that I have not asked you about that you think, in terms of creating, crafting, growing, sustaining great conversations in our lives, that you think people should know about?
I think we covered a lot of good stuff. We scratched the surface, hopefully enough was enough surface was scratched to make people kind of curious, to kind of challenge and push back. Like, you know, Ursula Le Guin, who's a famous science fiction writer, and I've loved her since I read The Wizard of Earthsea when I was a kid. And I'm going to paraphrase this, but she was very critical of a lot of things, and she got an award like maybe 2 years ago by now, and she gave her speech and she talked about, you know, everything can be challenged. And I use this all the time, of course, paraphrasing her more eloquent words, that, you know, 500 years ago, people believed in the divine rule of kings. And we don't think like that anymore. Like, everything can be challenged. You know, I don't care what it is. Every system that we live under was created by men, you know, people, but in some cases, primarily men.
Yeah.
Which should tell us a lot. And so therefore, challenge everything and use that to kind of push all your creative pursuits forward. So that's the one thing I would just leave everybody with, that nothing is the divine rule of kings.
That is a really, really good place to not to end, but to continue off from that. That's something that I think I try to think about often. If someone made it, it can be remade. And you do not have to be a slave to the way things are. And that is really awesome. Philip McKenzie, thank you so much. I hope I'm going to be around. We should continue the conversation offline, not try to extract and make a product out of all of the conversations that we have.
Definitely. I would love to. We can grab some lunch and make it happen, man. I would love to see you in person.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you making the time, man. Thank you so much.
No worries. I'll talk to you soon. All right.
All right. Be good.
Cheers.
And we're going to leave it right there. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please check out my other episodes at theconversationfactory.com/podcast. If you want to join the conversation, don't forget to check out theconversationfactory.com/coaching to sign up for 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on a future episode. That's theconversationfactory.com/coaching. Thanks so much for your fine attention, and I'll see you next time.